On the morning of November the 22nd, 1718, a man died in shallow water off the coast of North Carolina. He had been shot 5 times. He had been wounded more than 20 times in total. And according to the eyewitnesses who gave sworn testimony in court weeks later, he was still standing when he finally went down. His name was Edward Teach, but history remembers him as Blackbeard. And you are watching Dead Man's Shore, the channel where real history hits harder than any legend. Welcome back, everyone. If you are new here, I am so glad you found us. On this channel, we dig into the true stories behind the most dangerous people who ever sailed the open sea. No myths, no Hollywood nonsense. Just history as it actually happened. And today, we are covering one of the most dramatic turning points in all of maritime history, the end of the Golden Age of Piracy. Because here is the thing most people do not realize. Blackbeard's death was not just the end of one man. It was the opening move in a deliberate, empire-wide campaign to destroy an entire world that thousands of people had built from nothing, out at sea, away from kings and courts and trading companies that treated human lives as line items on a ledger. The empires that brought it down did not act in a panic. They were patient, they were strategic, and they were very, very good at what they did. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history that gets your blood going, please hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And leave a comment below. I want to know what you think. Were the pirates of the Golden Age genuine outlaws? Or were they something far more complicated than that? Write it down. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand why the death of one pirate in a shallow coastal channel mattered so much to so many powerful people, you first have to understand what had been building in the Caribbean for the better part of 30 years. And it all started with 2 wars and a catastrophic number of unemployed sailors. The War of the Grand Alliance ended in 1697. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714. Between them, these 2 conflicts had put hundreds of thousands of men to work at sea, sailors, privateers, naval volunteers, across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. Privateers, if that term is new to you, were essentially government-licensed attackers. They were issued documents called letters of marque that legally authorized them to raid enemy shipping during wartime. They were exceptionally good at their work. Then the wars ended. The licenses expired, and in 1714 alone, an estimated 2,500 British privateers found themselves out of work overnight. The Royal Navy demobilized tens of thousands more. These were men who knew how to sail, how to navigate, and how to fight at sea. What they did not know was how to farm, or keep accounts, or fit themselves into a peacetime economy that had no real use for their particular skills. The legal world had closed its doors. The illegal world had not. Within 4 years, piracy across the Caribbean and along the American coastline had erupted into a genuine crisis. Merchants in Boston, New York, and London were tallying losses in the tens of thousands of pounds. Insurance rates on Atlantic voyages tripled. Colonial governors were writing frantic letters to the Board of Trade in London, describing a situation that had moved entirely beyond local control. But here is the detail the official records tried to downplay. The pirates were not simply stealing. They were building something. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was the center of it. In 1713, the islands were British territory in name only. No garrison, no functioning courts, no real government of any kind. What they did have was a deep, sheltered harbor on the island of New Providence, positioned directly across the most critical shipping lanes between Europe and the Caribbean, and a growing population of sailors, shipwreck scavengers, and former privateers who wanted absolutely nothing to do with any empire ever again. By 1714, Nassau's harbor was filling up steadily with captured vessels being stripped and traded. By 1716, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pirates called New Providence their home port. They called themselves the Flying Gang. The name matters less than what they built. Nassau during those years functioned as a genuine town. It had a population, a working economy, and a system of social organization that governed itself without any reference to kings or parliaments. Prizes, the cargo and valuables taken from captured ships, were divided by vote among the crew. Captains could be removed from command by majority decision. A sailor who suffered a serious injury in battle received a payment from the communal fund before individual shares were calculated and distributed. The sick and the old were supported by that same fund. This was not democracy in any modern sense. These were hard men operating in a brutal world, and everything they built sat alongside real violence. But it was closer to self-governance than anything most of these men had ever experienced under the flag of any nation. They had come from a maritime world, where a ship's captain could have a sailor flogged at will, legally hold crew members on board against their wishes under existing law, withhold wages on a whim, and provide food so poor it caused illness at sea. If a sailor died on a voyage, his family received nothing. The pirates had lived all of that, and they built the opposite of it. The man most responsible for giving the Flying Gang its structure was not Blackbeard. It was a man named Benjamin Hornigold, older, steadier, and more far-sighted than most of the people around him. Hornigold understood instinctively that Nassau needed rules and internal discipline if it was going to survive as anything more than a temporary hiding place. He mentored an entire generation of pirates who had become the names history has remembered. Blackbeard sailed with him. Charles Vane sailed with him. Samuel Bellamy, who would eventually sail north and go down with his ship and all its treasure off the coast of Cape Cod in 1717, learned from him. Benjamin Hornigold built the Republic of Pirates. And then, Benjamin Hornigold accepted the king's pardon and became a pirate hunter. That single fact explains almost everything about how the Golden Age ended. Because the empires that brought it down were not relying on force alone. They were smarter than that. King George I issued his General Proclamation of Grace on September 5, 1717. The terms were clear and direct. Surrender to a colonial governor before September 5, 1718. Swear an oath, and the crown would pardon everything you had done at sea. Keep sailing after that deadline, and the crown would pursue you with everything at its disposal. The offer was genuine, the deadline was real, and the entire structure of it was designed to accomplish one specific thing: to fracture the pirate community from the inside out. The man chosen to physically deliver that offer to Nassau was Woodes Rogers, former privateer captain, merchant adventurer, and the man who had circumnavigated the entire globe between 1708 and 1711. Along the way, he had rescued a castaway named Alexander Selkirk from an uninhabited island off the Chilean coast. Selkirk's experience would eventually become the basis for Robinson Crusoe. Rogers moved in consequential circles. He was practical, relentless, and nearly bankrupt. He accepted the appointment as governor of the Bahamas in exchange for a salary and the opportunity to rebuild his finances. He arrived at Nassau on July the 11th, 1718, with 2 Royal Navy frigates, a company of soldiers, and the King's proclamation. What he found when he sailed into the harbor was less than half of what the Republic had been at its height. The pardon offer had been circulating through the Caribbean for months, and it had done precisely what London intended. Hornigold had already surrendered, Bellamy was dead, and Charles Vane, one of the most stubborn and capable men in the Atlantic, who trusted no government on earth, had sailed his sloop out through a back channel as Rogers came in through the front, firing his guns contemptuously as he went. Around 600 pirates on New Providence accepted the pardon and swore the oath. Rogers organized them into a militia, repaired the island's crumbling fortifications, and began the slow, unglamorous work of transforming a pirate haven into a functioning British colony. But the Golden Age's most famous figures had not been in Nassau to make that choice, and they were about to write the final chapters of the story themselves. Not everyone who accepted the King's pardon managed to stay accepted. Some men genuinely tried. They took the oath, collected whatever wages Rogers could afford, a fraction of what a successful voyage had once been worth, and attempted to build a quiet life on land. It didn't always take. Several men returned to sea within months. Rogers dealt with this by having them hanged. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not running a rehabilitation program. But for the pirates who had never come to Nassau at all, the ones already working the coastline when Rogers arrived, the pardon was a more complicated proposition entirely. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, had spent most of 1718 making himself the most recognizable pirate name in the Atlantic world. A significant portion of that was deliberate strategy. He understood that fear was a more efficient tool than force. When he prepared for battle, he wore slow-burning cord tucked into the braids of his beard, so that his face appeared wreathed in haze and smoke. It was theater, calculated and effective theater, and it worked exactly as intended. Ships that might otherwise have offered resistance often surrendered without any real fight at all. The historical record suggests that Blackbeard was, in reality, considerably less brutal than the image he worked so hard to project. He preferred quick, clean surrenders because they were faster and safer for everyone involved, including himself. His most audacious action in 1718, however, had nothing to do with individual battles. In May of that year, Blackbeard blockaded the entire port of Charlestown, South Carolina, for nearly a week. He captured 9 vessels in the harbor, he held prominent citizens for ransom, and he sent a formal demand to the Colonial Assembly, not for gold or silver, but for a chest of medical supplies, which he received before calmly sailing away. He made permanent enemies of every merchant family in Charlestown. Those families had connections in London. Blackbeard accepted the King's pardon shortly afterward, in June of 1718, receiving it from the governor of North Carolina, a man named Charles Eden, who, depending on which contemporary accounts you consult, was either personally tolerant of pirates or quietly conducting business with them on the side. Blackbeard settled in the town of Bath. He reportedly purchased a house, married a local woman, and gave every outward appearance of being a man who had put the sea behind him. He had not. By the autumn of 1718, Blackbeard was at sea again. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, had reached his limit. Spotswood had no legal jurisdiction over North Carolina's coastal waters. He dispatched Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy regardless, funding the expedition out of his own personal finances initially and claiming reimbursement from the Crown later. Maynard located Blackbeard in the shallow channel off Ocracoke Island. He anchored through the night with 2 small sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, and ordered his men to sleep below decks, so the ships would appear understaffed to any observer. At dawn, Blackbeard's crew opened fire first. The volley disabled one of Maynard's vessels and significantly reduced his available fighting force. But Maynard ordered his remaining men below decks as well, steering the Jane directly at Blackbeard's ship. When the pirates boarded what appeared to be a nearly empty vessel, Maynard's men came up through the hatches. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. Blackbeard sustained multiple serious wounds before he finally went down. His crew's resistance ended with him. Maynard sailed back to port with Blackbeard's head displayed at the bow of his ship. A deliberate public declaration from the Empire to every port on the Atlantic coast. The Golden Age was not fading on its own. It was being taken apart systematically, one figure at a time. That same December, in Charlestown, a man named Stede Bonnet was brought to trial. Bonnet is perhaps the most unusual figure in the entire history of Caribbean piracy, because he arrived at it from a direction nobody else had ever tried. He was a wealthy plantation owner from Barbados with no maritime background whatsoever. He purchased his own vessel, hired a crew, named the ship the Revenge, and sailed out into open water. According to every contemporary account with remarkable consistency, primarily to escape what multiple sources describe as an extremely difficult domestic situation at home. The ocean did not accommodate his inexperience politely. Bonnet encountered Blackbeard, who assumed command of his ship on the straightforward grounds that Bonnet demonstrably had no idea what he was doing. After accepting the king's pardon and then returning to piracy a second time, Bonnet was caught by a naval patrol off Cape Fear. He was transported to Charlestown for trial. He wept in court. He appealed repeatedly for mercy. The judge was unmoved. Bonnet was hanged in December of 1718, along with 29 members of his crew. The executions of 1718 were not the end of the Golden Age. They were the Empire's announcement that the end was coming, and that it intended to be there when it arrived. And what do you think, looking at men like Blackbeard and Bonnet, and the way the Crown pursued them? Were these men outlaws who brought their fate on themselves? Or were they caught up in something far larger than any individual could fight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Honestly, this is one of those debates that never gets old, and I want to hear where you stand on it. Charles Vane, the man who had fired his guns at Woodes Rogers and refused every offer of a pardon, kept operating for another year and a half after Nassau was retaken. He was eventually wrecked on an uninhabited island by a storm, rescued by a passing vessel, and recognized aboard it by a former pirate who had taken the pardon and was now living quietly and legally. Vane was handed over to the colonial authorities. Jamaica hanged him in 1720. The Republic was gone, but the people who had once lived inside it still had one final chapter left to write. In October of 1720, a small crew of pirates was anchored off the Jamaican coast when a naval sloop authorized by the island's governor came upon them in the night. Most of the crew of John Rackham, known as Calico Jack for the vividly colored cotton trousers he favored, were in no condition to mount a defense. The attack came suddenly, and the men below decks largely failed to respond to it. 2 members of the crew came up and fought back. Both of them were women. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the 2 names from the end of the Golden Age that absolutely refuse to be reduced to a footnote. Both had been living and working as active crew members on Rackham's vessel for months. Both knew exactly what they were part of and had chosen it. And when the attack came and the men around them did not respond, both of them stood their ground without hesitation. Rackham was captured, tried, and hanged at Port Royal in November of 1720. His body was placed in a display cage at the entrance to the harbor, a spot that still carries his name today, Rackham's Quay. At his trial, before the sentence was carried out, Anne Bonny visited him. According to contemporary court records, she told him that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought with the spirit he should have had, he would not have been brought to that place at all. It is not a gentle final word to give a man, but it is, by any measure, an honest one. Bonny and Reed were both convicted and both pleaded pregnancy, which delayed their sentences under the law of the time. Mary Reed died in prison in April of 1721, most likely from fever. What became of Anne Bonny after that? No record says. She disappears from the historical archive entirely. The silence where she ought to be is one of those gaps that history either left deliberately vague or simply never had the answer to fill. The last great figure of the Golden Age was Bartholomew Roberts, and he is worth understanding on his own terms because in almost every meaningful way, he is different from everyone else in this story. Roberts did not choose piracy. In 1719, he was taken from a legitimate vessel, a ship called the Princess, by the crew of a pirate captain named Howell Davis. Roberts was an exceptionally skilled navigator, which made him valuable. He was pressed into service against his will. Davis was killed in a Portuguese ambush 6 weeks later. The crew held an election to choose a new captain and voted for Roberts. He accepted. What Roberts built over the next 3 years was the largest and most successful pirate operation in the entire recorded history of the Atlantic world. He captured an estimated 400 vessels. At his peak, he commanded a fleet of 4 ships and several hundred men, a force roughly equivalent in strength to the naval resources most colonial governors could realistically assemble against him. He operated across a range that stretched from Brazil to West Africa to the Caribbean to the waters off Newfoundland. He also wrote his own code of conduct, a detailed document governing how prizes were divided among the crew, how prisoners were to be treated, what compensation an injured sailor would receive, and how disputes between crew members were to be resolved. It was a considered, organized piece of work, the kind of document produced by someone who takes the running of a ship seriously. Roberts had no illusions about his own situation. Across multiple independent accounts and sources from the period, he is recorded as stating that a short life lived freely was the best he could hope for. That is not the voice of a man in love with the life he is living. That is the voice of a man who made a decision with open eyes and understood precisely where it would lead. The Royal Navy's campaign against Roberts was methodical and unhurried. Captain Challoner Ogle, commanding HMS Swallow, was assigned to the West African coast where Roberts had been operating. On February the 10th, 1722, Ogle located Roberts's fleet anchored off Cape Lopez in the territory now known as Gabon. A significant portion of Roberts's crew was in poor condition to fight, having marked a celebration the night before. Ogle used the same approach that Maynard had used against Blackbeard, allowing his ship to appear far less threatening than it actually was until he had closed to an effective distance. Roberts was on deck when the first volley came. He was struck and killed almost at once. His crew, following instructions he had given them in advance, threw his body overboard rather than allow the Royal Navy to claim it. The remaining crew surrendered. The trial that followed at Cape Coast Castle, in the territory now known as Ghana, was the largest piracy trial in the history of the British Empire. 262 men were tried, 52 were hanged, 37 were sentenced to hard labor in the nearby gold mines. The rest were acquitted or transported elsewhere. The proceedings were handled efficiently, because efficiency was now the point. The crown was not making examples anymore. It was finishing the work. Historians conventionally mark 1726 as the end of the Golden Age of Piracy. That year corresponds to the execution of a man named William Fly in Boston, who went to the gallows still refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and who reportedly used his final moments to address the ship captains gathered in the crowd, telling them directly that it was the brutal treatment sailors received under men like them that produced men like him. His body was displayed afterward on an island in Boston Harbor. Cotton Mather, the minister, witnessed it and wrote about it for publication. The Empire made certain those details circulated. But the question that stays with me every single time I work through this history is not when the Golden Age ended. It is what it actually was, and what its end actually cost. The pirates of the Golden Age were not heroes in any straightforward sense. They terrorized merchant sailors who had done nothing to them. They held innocent passengers for ransom. They caused genuine harm across 3 oceans. The economic desperation that pushed many of them into piracy in the first place does not cancel what they did once they got there. But what they built alongside all of that, at Nassau, in their ship codes, in the votes they held before major decisions, in the funds they maintained for the sick and the injured, tells a second story running alongside the first one. They came from a maritime world where sailors could be disciplined at a captain's sole discretion. Held on board against their will under existing law, paid late or not at all, given spoiled provisions, and left with nothing if they died at sea. Their families inherited nothing. The system that employed them regarded them as interchangeable parts of a machine. The pirates built the opposite of that system, imperfectly, sometimes brutally, but deliberately and with a clear sense of what they were building it in opposition to. The governments that dismantled it were not simply restoring law and order. There is an important distinction between restoring order and protecting commerce, and what the Crown was primarily doing was the latter. The merchants of London and Bristol and Boston who lobbied for faster colonial courts and funded pirate hunting expeditions were not primarily motivated by concern for the ordinary sailors the pirates had attacked. They were motivated by insurance costs, disrupted shipping routes, and the threat to a trading system that generated their wealth. The law served their interests. They were very effective at using it. The pardons fractured the community from within. The court proceedings became faster and no longer required transporting prisoners to London. Former pirates who had taken pardons became some of the most effective hunters because they knew exactly where to look and exactly what to look for. And so, one by one, and then in batches, the men and women who had constructed an alternative to the world they were born into were tracked down and brought before judges. Blackbeard's head displayed at the bow of Maynard's ship, Vane in irons in a Jamaican prison, Rackham in a cage above the harbor entrance, Roberts going over the side of his own deck rather than be claimed. The voices of the ordinary pirates are almost entirely silent now. The sailor who cast his vote to make Roberts captain after Davis died. The woman who fought when the men around her would not. The formerly enslaved men who made up an estimated 30% of pirate crews in the Caribbean, and who found in piracy the only form of genuine liberty available to them anywhere in the early 18th century. Those voices did not survive in the archive. What remains is the outline. 30 years of a world the empires had not authorized and could not control. A harbor in the Bahamas where decisions were made by collective vote. Ships where the first payment after a battle went to the injured before any individual received their share. A woman whose last recorded words to the man she had sailed with were that he should have fought harder. And then the Royal Navy, and the courts, and the cages above the harbor entrances, and the long, quiet return of an ocean that went back to belonging to kings and companies. The empires won. They always win, in the end. But they won against something real, something that thousands of people had built from nothing, out of genuine conviction that the world they had been handed did not have to be the only world available to them. Understanding what was destroyed is the only way to understand what was actually lost. And the sea, which remembers nothing, kept the secret of it for 300 years, until the archives gave it back. Thank you so much for watching Dead Man's Shore. If this story got under your skin, if it left you thinking about what the Golden Age really was and what it cost the world to end it, please leave a comment. I want to know, do you think history has ever given the pirates of this era the honest accounting they deserve? Or has the legend always drowned out the truth? Write it below. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is so much more history on this channel, and every single story here deserves to be told properly. Until next time, stay curious. The sea forgets nothing.